the floor. So brief announcement before we get started with the first session today. And that is AshiCon will be in Nashville next summer in June. I'm willing to help people organize sessions on econometrics. The last couple of years, we've had organized sessions on econometrics that have been very popular. Last summer, we had a room with 200 plus people to hear about different papers. So I'll send out an email, but if you have a paper on econometrics and health and are looking for people, I can help lift people up. Do that. So without further ado, Toru Kitagawa will hold this paper.
Good. Thanks so much. Thank you for including me in the workshop. And I'm sorry that I couldn't make it yesterday. I'm doing placement director Brown. And yesterday, Brown had a job market jamborees where to be candidates that can present their job market papers, like for the whole day event. So I couldn't make it. But if you got any interest in Brown job market candidates, yeah, I'm happy to. More information. Anyway, so this is the paper by Federico Crippa. He's there, grad student at Northwestern. So the paper is about regret analysis in threshold policy design. And this is okay. So this paper is about treatment choice, or it's also called policy learning. So this is the kind of field in econometrics which is growing and recently very active in the current econometrics literature. So if we look at past job candidates in econometrics job market, like every year, there are 2, 3, 4 job candidates coming on the market and they do well. And so it's kind of active field. So the main question of this literature is who should be treated? So if we do program evaluations, causal inference studies, that we are often interested in average causal effects. And not only average causal effects, we are also interested in conditional average effect, conditioning on individuals' observable characteristics. And we are also interested in heterogeneity of the causal effects. Well, heterogeneity itself is maybe scientifically interesting, but from the policy point of view, why heterogeneity is important? Well, because we want to know who get benefit, who wins and who loses from the treatment. And we want to make use of that for designing targeting policy. So who should be treated or who should not be treated? So this literature in econometrics has initiated started from Dismansky's 2004 econometric paper. And he laid out the basic framework and then worked out the simple setting. And then my paper with Alex Stetanov 2018, more recently, there's a paper by Mubakov, Tabo Mihan, AC and Wager. So they look at more like realistic setting where we have rich set of covariance. So here the planner can observe individuals' characteristics in like multi-dimensions, like high dimensional characteristics. And then based upon that, planner wants to decide, okay, this person should be treated or not. So that's more like realistic setting, yeah? And then, yeah, that maybe as you would agree, this targeting, that can be a central policy questions in various contexts, not only in health economics, but also in labor. Who should get labor job training programs, for instance, in development economics, who should get conditional cash transfers, maybe in public economics, yeah, who should be tax audited, yeah, and maybe in health, who should be health insured. Yeah. So there are maybe every problem you work on in your empirical work, you can find something related to questions like targeting. Okay, so outline of my talk. So the Federico's paper is basically they're making good contributions on this literature approach of empirical welfare maximizations. So that's what I worked with, and that I worked in the past with Alex Stetanov. And so I want to give a bit of time to introduce setting and give a quick review of what this method is. Yeah, and then based upon that, yeah, I'm going to present the proposal by Federico, which he calls smooth welfare maximizations. And I summarize the takeaways of his papers. And later on, yeah, I'm going to give my comments and my questions to Federico. That's outline. Okay, here's the basic plain vanilla setting of this statistical treatment chart. So here, planner or econometrician that has a randomized controlled trial sample. So experiment has been already conducted. And in this experimental data, we observe those variables. Oh, I made a typo here. Okay. So in this data set, we observe the pre-treatment observed covariates, maybe past earnings, education, etc., of individual I. Yeah. So those are usually covariates. If you do causal inference, you're going to estimate conditional average treatment effect given this kind of xi. Yeah. So this xi is available here. And then in the data set, the DI treatment is randomized. Possibly conditional on xi. That's fine. Yeah. So somehow, yeah, you have a good data set in which DI is randomized. I should use Y instead of Z. So YI. Okay, YI is the post-treatment observed outcome. So those data sets are already given to econometrician. Now that based upon this data set, the econometrician wants to estimate policy, and the econometrician wants to recommend this policy to planner. Yeah, and the planner is going to implement this policy to the population where the data set was drawn. So here the object of interest is we call assignment rule denoted by pi. So pi is mapping individual's characteristics x into either 0 or 1. So here I'm assuming this pi is a kind of deterministic, non-randomized assignments, but here the pi is mapping who should be treated or who should not be treated. So here 1 means treated and 0 is not treated. Okay, there should be pi. Yeah, not a z. This is pi. Yeah. So then the here planner has objective function, and the planner's objective function is planner wants to maximize the sum of outcomes in the population. So if planner implements policy pi, yeah, then the planner assigns treatment according to this pi. So individuals, so this is a new population, yeah, future individuals or new population, I mean new individuals. If their or her, if his or her x, if his pi of x equal to 1, then the individual will be treated, right? And the realized outcome gonna be y of 1. If pi of x is recommending 0, yeah, then that person is not treated, and the realized outcome gonna be y of z. Yeah. But then the planner wants to sum up these outcomes that will be attained by this policy pi, yeah, and then sum up in terms of expectation. So take expectation. So we're taking expectation with respect to here population. And this population is also giving, generated this RCT data in the past. So I'm somehow implicitly assuming the environment is stationary. Okay, here goal is now using this data set already collected, the planner wants to learn the treatment assignment policy pi hat, which performs well in terms of this welfare criteria. Yeah. So I put the hat here because pi is constructed upon the data. Okay, so then the econometrics question is, what's the best way to come up with this pi hat? Yeah, how to make use of data set to recommend policy. So in this framework, the one approach that I worked with, I proposed with Alex Tetanov in 2018 is that we estimate this assignment policy by maximizing empirical welfare, W hat of pi. So we first specify what would be a class of feasible policies. So we first figure out what policies planners can implement, or planner is interested in implementing. So policy has, let's say, there's a class of policies. So this policy is going to be indexed by few parameters, which is also the case then. But then among these candidate policies, we want to figure out which pi is performing best in terms of empirical welfare. Why is empirical welfare? Well, empirical welfare is constructed from the RCT data. So from the RCT data, we estimate what welfare would be attained if pi is implemented. So this expression is, here's the population welfare we will be interested in maximizing, since this involves potential outcomes, right? So then if the data set is coming from RCT data, then we can unbiasedly estimate this population welfare criterion by using this technique of propensity score weighting, inverse propensity score weighting. So in the causal inference, we're going to estimate average treatment effect under unconfoundedness assumption. The unconfoundedness assumption means conditional on xi if di is randomized. Yeah, then you can estimate underlying potential average treatment effect by taking the sample average of yi times di divided by e of xi. But here e of xi is propensity score. Inverse propensity score weighted sum of outcome. Yeah, that's gonna unbiasedly estimate the average treatment effect. So in case of this welfare, yeah, they keep the pi of x right here, but then by replacing y1, y0 by the inverse propensity score weighted outcome, you can actually unbiasedly estimate the population welfare. So from the data set, from this good RCT data set, we can estimate this population welfare from the data. Right? So that's empirical welfare. And then find what policy is going to maximize it. Yeah, in terms of empirical welfare. So that's what, and that's the one way to construct pi hat. So then my notation is jumping around. Sorry, I put the pi as a class of policies, right? So this should be pi. Right. So then in this approach, one important step is how to first set up class of policies that planner wants to implement. But then this is kind of one important input of the methods. But here, the way we design, when we specify this class of policies, we first think about what constraints policymakers are facing in reality. And often the treatment assignment or targeting policy can be implemented by, say, single index, meaning the planner first wants to calculate a single number, like poverty index or some other index, which measures which aggregate individuals' characteristics into one number and put a threshold. And whether this number should be above or not, and based upon that, we allocate treatment. So in case of like poverty, like financial aid like program, we first calculate households poverty index, and then come up with a threshold. And if poverty index is above the threshold, we give treatment, otherwise not. So those are simple assignment rule, but those simple assignment rule is modeled in this class pi. Yeah, we will see more specific expression here. We can also think about many other constraints like, oh, well, the assignment policy has to respect these distributive concerns so that maybe assignment of the program has to be monotonic in one's graph. And we want to prioritize to poorer households than richer. Yeah. So this is also can be incorporated in this class pi. By the way, if you have questions, please stop me anytime. Is that the format of the, yeah, this one. Okay, so then in the Federico's paper, we consider the following class of assignment policy. So we see individuals potentially high dimensional X. Yeah. Now aggregate this individual's characteristics X into one number, G of X, that's the index. And then we allocate treatment based upon this assignment rule, whether this aggregated index is above T or not. That's the specific policy he calls threshold assignment policy. And here G is known, G is given. So that means policy, well, basically what we want to estimate is just threshold with T. We want to find the optimal threshold which maximizes the planner's welfare criteria. And I think that this class of policy is currently implemented in many contexts. For instance, clinical guidelines. The medical doctor has guidelines, and here the guideline says, okay, certain measurement is above this threshold. Okay, prescribe this drug or do this kind of treatment. So this kind of policy is quite common. Maybe healthcare insurance as well, Medicare, as well as age above 65. access to insurance, right? So those are again threshold policy. Anti-poverty program as well. There's a poverty index exceeding or maybe below certain threshold. Yeah, that should be treated or not. Yeah, and so on. So you can come up with many policy assignments using this class. Right. So then the next slide. Okay, I want to discuss why this pi hat is good. In what sense pi hat is good? But then the literature has figured out some statistical optimality property of this pi hat. Yeah. So the desirable statistical property here means if you look at the regret, why is this? Well, so we have a class of policies, feasible policies, and then we have a welfare criterion. Soup, okay, what's the maximum attainable welfare over this class of policies? Subtracting welfare attained by the estimated policy. So here planner econometrician estimates pi and then recommend this to planner. Planner implements it, and payoff of the planner is W pi hat DW. This difference is regret. We call regret. Let's get loss of welfare by estimating this pi hat by the data instead of doing Oracle. So this is a welfare loss. Then this regret is a random variable because pi hat is random. It's constructed upon the data, so it's random. So let's look at expectation of or maybe some other feature is fine, but let's look at some feature of the distribution regret. Then my paper with Alex, we showed that this expectation of the welfare regret converges to 0. Here, uniformly means here this C, the universal constant that doesn't depend upon underlying distribution of potential outcomes. The uniformly this welfare regret converges to 0 at the rate 1 over square root n. Here we are looking at a very simple class of policies. So complexity is just some number. Yeah? In this case, actually 1. So that's the result. And then this is so-called optimal or minimax optimal rate, meaning there's no any other methods to get pi hat, which can make this regret converge faster than this 1 over square root n rate uniformly over large class of the distribution potential outcome. So that's the theoretical result. Well, so there's a nice theoretical properties here, but the method is not quite implementable in practice at this point, because when we actually estimate pi hat, we have to maximize this empirical welfare criterion over pi. But if depending upon class of pi, this optimization can be very difficult. So there's some drawback. Also, what's important is this kind of optimization problem is quite similar to Mansky's maximum score estimator, like it's a semi-parametric estimation of the binary probabilities. So in that current context, in the Federico's paper, he considers this threshold policy. So essentially, the pi is indexed only by this t. So finding optimal threshold is just a one-dimensional optimization problem. So we can always do grid search to find one t. So that, in that sense, this class of policy is kind of good in the sense computation is simple. So we don't really face this bottleneck of the implementation. Okay, so then that's basically a quick review. I think I spent too much time on this, but let me get to the paper's work, the Federico's paper's contents. So then his proposal is that so this is the welfare criterion, that we would write down, empirical welfare criterion we would write down with threshold policy. So we have indicator functions here. But now let's replace these indicator functions by something smooth. So indicator function is 0 and then jump up to 1. Right? Now let's make this a smoother. So let's put the cumulative distribution function of some random variables such as like logit or probit. So replace this indicator functions. Sorry, this should be greater than t. Should be greater than t. Yeah. Replace these indicator functions by some CDF. and then the smooth functions, and then how steep that this slope gonna be controlled by bandwidth sigma n. And in order to actually get the consistent estimate for optimal t, we want this bandwidth shrink to zero. So that's a usual non-parametric like smoothing technique. Right? If you want to do density estimations or regression estimations, you want to do non-parametric smoothing technique. In order to get consistency, you have to control this bandwidth of the kernel function. So that's something similar here. So to me, okay, when I read this idea, okay, this is nice, and then certainly I can see that given the relation, given the similarity of the problem to maximum score problem, there's some like preceding idea of smoothing this indicator by something continuous smooth CDF. And that's actually what Joel Horowitz, he did in '92 in Necrometrica, the improving Mansky's maximum score estimate. So I see some analogy here. Okay, so the main question is, is this smoothing of the empirical welfare, is it good? Well, yes, if the underlying W of t is smooth. So here we view this as a like estimator for underlying objective functions. Here objective function is indexed by this t. So if underlying function is smooth in t, always smoothing, putting kernel and smoothing always improves some statistical performance. So okay, I said that, well, original pi hat already has certain optimality property. But I said uniform over a large class of distribution data. Here, large class, okay, I'm not assuming anything about smoothness. But then his idea, okay, now Federico's idea is, okay, let's put the smoothness and should perform well if we restrict the class of underlying distribution data to something smoother. Yeah, then we can get something good happen. So that's the proposal, and so this is the main theorems in Federico's papers. So here the key assumptions. Okay, there are some other assumptions as well, but for me, key assumptions to derive this nice result is first, welfare criterion here viewed as a function of threshold. Okay, that is maximized uniquely at t star. So there's a unique optimal policy. Also, that this W of t is differentiable in t by s times. How many times you can differentiate. So that is basically controlling how smooth the underlying function is. And then there's a certain choice of bandwidth, sigma n. So sigma n converges to 0 at a certain rate. And this rate depends upon how smooth the underlying function is. So that's usually how we specify the optimal bandwidth in the non-parametric problem. Then here he made the following comparison. Right, should put so the first two. So this is t hat EWM. So if you would implement EWM, then under this assumption, one can say that optimal threshold estimator converges to optimal threshold at the rate cubic, 1 over cubic, right? So this kind of exotic, funky rate, but that's what happens. In terms of regret, okay, regret is this difference, right? This regret converges to 0 at the rate n power to the 2 over 3. So that's what you would achieve under EWM. In Federico's smooth welfare maximizations, so we can improve in a certain case. So the rate, so he showed that rate is n sigma n square root for the t hat and the n sigma n for the regret. So then by comparing this rate, if s is greater than or equal to 3, so that means underlying welfare is 3 times differentiable or more, then this convergence rate is faster than. So in that sense, that we can learn optimal policy quicker by smoothing the underlying welfare functions than just using indicator. So that's the main theoretical result. And then he performed some Monte Carlo simulations showing that welfare gain or regret gain is about 15% to 80%, depending upon sample size, depending upon DDP. Okay, so I have 5 minutes. So here's some empirical illustrations from Federico's paper. This figure is from my paper with Alex. So just to show what kind of data set he's looking at. So he's looking at this job training JTPA study. So that's the experimental study of job training program in the United States. And here I'm showing conditional average treatment effect. I specify X to be years of education and pre-program annual earnings. So this is experimental data. And we are estimating conditional average treatment effect in the non-parametric regressions. So we see these dots. So those are the individuals observed in the data. And then this size of dots are showing how many individuals are there in each point. Right, and the green ones, so those are the positive effects. Red ones are negative effects. So this data, we see the job training program is quite heterogeneous. There's a lot of welfare gains around here. Right. So then basically Federico take this data, then estimate the assignment policy based upon threshold. So here threshold is right. So here he uses earnings. So that means okay, pre-program annual earnings and try to find the threshold. And then below a certain threshold, we want to allocate treatment. Above should not be treated. So that kind of threshold policy. And then he estimate T hat, EWM, also T hat, SWM, and he got point estimates about 6,600 for T EWM, but about 6,000 for SWM. Basically, our optimal threshold is somewhere around here. And below this threshold, we should treat, otherwise not to treat. But given this Kate estimates, I think that this estimates make sense. And then he also put the confidence intervals about this optimal policy. And right, so if we see confidence intervals, okay, you get something tighter. Okay, so then my remarks, I think assuming smoothness of this welfare criterion, to me, it's not quite restrictive, especially for economics applications. So economics applications, things are very noisy. And we kind of believe underlying condition expectation is continuous or maybe smooth. In machine learning applications, actually, this can be very, very restrictive assumption. But in economics, I think putting smoothness is fine. However, to me, okay, very difficult to argue how many times differential, second times, third times. So those are very local property of the functions. So I think in the given application, it's kind of difficult to imagine how many times differential. And certainly optimal choice of bandwidth depends upon what to assume about how many times differential. So those are, I think that's something we should note. And also I think here's a nice result about asymptotic distributions for the optimal T and also welfare level itself. So my experience working with applied people, they always want to put the confidence intervals for policy, also confidence intervals for welfare gain. So this kind of distributional theory is going to be useful for that. Okay, so then there are my comments. So I have 7 comments. I don't know how much. Well, anyway. So first, okay, some conceptual or practical questions. I thought, well, so he basically takes threshold policy as like coming from kind of current practice. Current practice is often done in that way. Index is given somehow, and then they just figure out threshold. But to me, if one wants to optimize welfare, we also want to estimate index together with threshold. What kind of poverty index is good to optimize welfare? Well, instead of trusting existing one, let's estimate something new. Yeah, so that can be something. I think that makes sense. So then I believe okay, his framework can be extended to estimate optimal index as well. Second, I think his papers emphasizes the inference part of the optimal policies and welfare. But to me, okay, this is like kind of open questions. We set up the decision problem, planner's decision problem, and the wider inference, doing inference is good or improves the planner's decision making. To me, it's not clear why putting confidence intervals, do some hypothesis testing. That's why why it's important for the planner's decisions. I think that kind of open like philosophical question. So second, okay, I didn't show a specific expression for the asymptotic distribution, but this asymptotic distribution actually has a bias term. And this seems correcting bias requires some delicate analysis. So yeah, how to deal with this bias, that's gonna be another practical questions. I have some more technical questions. Maybe I can just choose. Yeah. Right. Right, maybe sixth one. Sixth one is the right. So as I said, if you restrict underlying W of t welfare function to smoother ones, then the SWM always improve the regret convergence rate. But if it's misspecified, or the underlying function is continuous, maybe, but not differentiable at optimal t, then does smoothing harm in any sense? That's one technical question. And seven, okay, so that's I think also very interesting question. So current proposal to specify this bandwidth sigma n, we have to assume something about how many times differentiable. But we don't know anything about how many times differentiable. How do we really set up bandwidths? So when we say adaptive methods means without really knowing how smooth the underlying function is, there's some automated method to estimate smoothing parameter. And if that works well, then that's called adaptive. So I don't know if there's any adaptive proposal available in this class of models. So that's something I think interesting in theoretical questions for the future. Okay, so let me just finish. Yeah, and then so here right, so EWM. Okay, my proposal with Alex that uses only the empirical distribution. We don't do any smoothing. Just use the empirical distribution of the data to estimate parameters. But this leaves potential welfare gain on the table if underlying function is smooth. So the Federico's papers, given novel contributions to the literature by exploiting this smoothness, additional smoothness assumption. And I think it's sensible for economics applications. But however, the choice of tuning parameter, that is always a delicate problem. So ideally, I want to see if there's any way to make things adaptive. But let me finish here. Thanks so much. Sorry. For being here. Maybe we can.
I'd like to address some of these comments with some thoughts. I think like the computational questions, exactly as you said, I think because I studied that very simple case, computation is not a problem in the sense that even in my Monte Carlo simulation, I can do grid search. So is not an improvement. My understanding is that for this case where you also need to estimate the coefficients for the linear index, basically like the objective function for the empirical welfare maximization rules is probably piecewise flat. So that's where the hard problem is coming from. With a smooth estimator should be a smooth function. So probably it's easier in the sense that some type of algorithm can be used, but the uniqueness of the maximum is not unique. So still there are some issues there. So it's not that everything is solved easily, because there are multiple maxima. So my understanding is that maybe something gets easier, but how much I don't have an answer. The second question, well, is quite interesting. In some sense, I agree with you that inference is not the main goal, and in the sense that in my mind, what I wanted to do when I started to study the asymptotic distribution of the regret was not only for inference, was mostly like I want to understand which features of the underlying distribution of the data has an impact on the regret, like when we should expect a larger regret, for example. Because I think like from the bounds results in your paper, that for sure they were covering many more classes, but there was harder to understand like how the data were fitting, like were mapping into the regret. But then it's true, I mean, that's also something that they do in an appendix. They say, yes, you can use this result to derive some confidence interval. I agree that in general, like for policy learning, why we don't need the confidence interval. Someone can argue that, like, suppose that we really want to use this method to maybe change a threshold in some type of clinical guidelines. That is something that happened. I think currently in these clinical guidelines, when a threshold is changing, they run just a 2 arms type of experiment. So they have the status quo, they have a new one. How we set the new one, I think, is just someone came up and say, hey, like, let's do 90 rather than 100, and then let's test. But we can imagine that suppose that we want, in some sense, learn the optimal threshold from the data, and still there are some the FDA say yes, but you need to show that the new one is statistically different from the previous one. So maybe in those contexts, but it's not my first goal. So my first goal is not to do inference on the policy. And I think also the third point is sort of related in the sense that for me, the idea is like, okay, when we start to think about this smooth rule, some bias appears. So let's be aware of the bias, but the main goal is not to estimate the bias for the confidence interval, is more the idea, okay, like maybe there are some rate improvement, but it comes at a sort of a cost of this bias, and having an expression for the bias to say, okay, in which context we should expect the bias to be an issue, like I provide, at least the bias depends again on the distribution of the data when we do think that can be a problem. And this, I think, is related to the next question about when does smoothing harm, if any? Because exactly as you said, like basically we can improve the rate, adding some assumption, but the idea is that we are heavily exploiting that assumption, and what happens if the assumption is violated? We expect like a worse performance. And actually it is interesting because once I derived my results, I exactly wanted to show these in some simulations. So say, okay, let's try to push a bit. Like the theory is also giving us the limit of the theory. So let's go in a context in which we expect we cannot use the smooth rule. And I use this same type of example, like an objective function discontinues at the optimal threshold. Turns out that actually this is not a problem. This can even improve the convergence rate, because here the problem is not with the first derivative, that is this discontinuity, but is more with the second derivative. In the sense that we should imagine a context in which maybe it is even discontinuous, but assume a continuous conditional average treatment effect, but with a very high second derivative. And in my mind, it's not exactly clear how does it look like a function with a very high second derivative. But I think what they do in some type of local asymptotic study in one of the appendix is exactly pushing this. And basically, the second derivative is exactly the term that is entering in the bias. So basically what happened like is that the bias is increasing. And if we let the bias increase with the sample size exactly as is written here, the convergence rate is low down. So that is captured by that part of the theory. In practice, for me, it's harder to imagine a situation in which this is an issue, like because the second derivative, like a large second derivative, is not included. And about this adaptivity, I think like the way I'm thinking about how to use in practice this smooth rule is like we need to assume some type of like how smooth we assume is the function. But the way I'm thinking about this is just like to be very conservative. So just like assume the existence of, let's say, the second derivative. And that is fine, even if like we have infinite derivative, it's still fine. It's not that we don't need to pick the exact number. In terms of the rate, we are already having a sort of an improvement. And so I think like the best way to use this type of result is to be very conservative. And this is similar in my mind to what is happening with some type of kernel regression, where it's true that potentially we can use some type of higher order kernel, but I think like the practice is to use like a second order kernel. We actually know in that case that is probably the best choice in the finite sample. So I don't, I'm not sure this is adaptive, but in my mind, like I will never say, okay, you really need to get, you need to exploit these up to the last derivative that you can assume. My suggestion would be no, just go conservative. If you are fine to assuming an additional smoothness degree, do it. But then, and do I have still some time or?
Like, not really, no.
We can discuss maybe
Yeah,
later.
yeah, sure, no, of course. I realized I forgot to bring one more thing.
Oh.
I enjoyed it.
Okay. Always great to hear that. Now we can open up for other questions. Maggie.
Maishi, I really enjoyed this and I'm on the next paper and I now see why you guys put the two papers together. And so this is very, very relevant to what my co-author and I are exploring. So I have two questions for, I guess, either one of you. In order to actually estimate this thing, do you need an RCT or can you do it with quasi-exogenous variation? And specifically, if you don't know exactly for the threshold, if you have situations where T is moving around, but you can't precisely nail down like what is the T. So I can explain maybe a little bit more, but we have this threshold, which like is a set threshold, but then depending on when you start the clock, threshold is like more or less binding. And so we see empirically like there are people who, if you start too late and you're just really far from the threshold, it's not binding for you. So we have like variation in how binding the threshold is, but we don't have precise like this person was assigned threshold 10, 20, 30. Can you do it without an RCT with the situation
Well,
like that?
so just what clarify here, in the data set, there's a threshold already.
Mhm.
In the data set, this threshold is moving around.
The threshold is not moving. The time that you have to get to the threshold varies across people. For some people, because if there's no threshold, because it's not binding.
Yeah, right. So here, when I tell RCT data, there's actually no threshold, just treatments are randomized.
Got it.
In available data. But in the observational study, it's possible maybe treatments are assigned according to some existing threshold T. But in the data set, there's some random like variations, like some individuals kind of randomly switch to the other group and so on. Then that means, okay, you can take this as kind of quasi experimental variations. And then we can write down the empirical welfare criterion with the observational data. But then we have to estimate propensity scores and so on, right? So then it's important to use doubly robust estimator for welfare factor. So there's a bit of technical change here, but yeah. So it's possible to use the observational data.
And then a second question I have is like, where does the welfare weight go into this? So like both of you have an example with the One Jobs program, and how do you incorporate the welfare weight, or like what is the assumption?
Means
or did you incorporate a welfare weight?
well,
Like
the planner has a different weights over different individuals.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
where does that go into the?
Well, if the one setting is like if the welfare weights is just a function of observable characteristics X, and if we know it, then we construct a weighted average of the outcome as a welfare criterion.
So just it goes into pi.
So there's not much difficulty within the welfare weights. I think what's more difficulty is like, okay, I'm only looking at the sum of outcome like welfare criterion. I know depending upon context, people want to have a nonlinear welfare criterion, or maybe we want to make welfare criterion dependent on Gini inequality index. Then the things become more interesting.
I have an empirical application for your paper.
Right, Austin.
Yes, thank you. So I have one question for Federico and one for you. It's a more general one. So for Federico, so in a lot of the contexts where threshold policy, assignments might be considered by the policymaker, they might also have other constraints in terms of a budget. So you can imagine that what they might just do, in terms of thinking about threshold, is to rank people, treat them until they run out of the budget. So in some sense, how is this framework related to that sort of framework, the practice where there might be a constraint in terms of budget or other aspects for the policymaker?
I think like if it's that type of budgeting problem, I'm not sure it can be captured by this framework. Something different is like if you have an idea of the average cost. So basically you don't want to treat only people who are getting like a positive treatment effect, but you want sort of discount it by the cost of the product. That can be easily done. The other types, not direct, I don't think can be directly included in this type of framework.
Well, maybe in one special case is if the budget constraints can be transformed into capacity constraints. Capacity constraint means how many individuals at most can treat in the population. Then my paper with Alex, we have one extensions how to incorporate capacity constraints. That's one special case of dealing with budget.
And then my second question is just more of a bigger conceptual one about this entire literature, you know, read by yourself and other people. So in terms of when you estimate the conditional average treatment effects and you use them for policy learning in this case, I think of that as sort of suggesting that the treatment effects only vary by things you observe, not vary by things that are unobserved to the econometrician. And so if a policy is sort of selected based on these frameworks and other people in the future are assigned to treatment that way, you know, how should we think about how to evaluate policies in that new population, knowing that assignment rule is solely based on treatment effects that vary by X, and in the new population, you might have treatment effects varying by other unobservables, but you're treating people only in the future based on policies based on only X. So is there a way to think about how problematic that is in terms of treating future populations with policies that solely are allowed to vary by X and not in general by unobservables too?
Right. Well, first, if the planner cannot observe it, I mean, if there are unobservable characteristics, which is important for generating heterogeneity, like it's not observable, then the planner cannot make use of it, right? But by looking at the conditional average treatment effect given observables, already like this unobservable is kind of averaged out, so that dependence between observable and unobservables, they're already kind of taken into account in the conditional average treatment effect calculation. So it's, but that's best runner can do. But maybe one way to put it something. I mean, so if planner wants to exploit somehow unobservables for the individuals, what planner should do is planner try to exploit the self-selection of the individuals. So in the current framework, I presented that here the planner is acting like paternalistic. Okay? Give treatment, not to give treatment. But if we believe, if we write down a selection model, like a Roy model, right? Then the individuals, they have unobservables comparing Y1, Y0. And then if the individuals are rational, then they can choose better treatment for them. If in the population, we believe there exists this kind of individuals, right? Okay, rational individuals who can actually maximize their utility functions, but actually the utility function is actually in line with the welfare criterion. Then the question is, okay, how to identify, how to learn those individuals. So I have a recent paper with people in Japan that we basically consider treatment allocations. Here the planner is allocating who should self-select the treatment, who the planner should directly intervene and then assign in a paternalistic way. So in this way that we can start exploiting unobservables. Basically, exploiting unobservable is basically giving options and then let the individual choose. But we have to identify who can make a good decisions from the planner's perspective.
We have almost no time. Okay. Quick question.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, Jason. So I think this is incredibly interesting and important from a policy perspective, because it is that policymakers are constantly trying to draw inference about what the threshold should be. But typically you don't just have one set of RCT results. You maybe have a bunch of RCT results. And I can imagine that you could say, well, we could just combine them all into one and pick a threshold based on, the multiple RCT. But I can also imagine that if I did this for each RCT, I get different thresholds. And so I was just wondering how you would sort of think about combining RCTs to come up with a threshold for policymakers to use.
I think like one of the underlying assumption here is that the population on which the RCT is conducted is like the same population on which then you want to implement maybe like in case you have multiple RCT on the same population, I would say like, I don't know exactly how to do it, but I imagine that they are all informative in some sense in the same way. Or like if RCTs are run in different populations, maybe it is that maybe there are like in different population, different optimal thresholds. And I don't know exactly how. I think, yeah, my idea is like try to map the population of the experiment to which the policy wants to do.
Good, thank you.